Psychedelics today. Today on the show we have Paul Austin. Paul Austin is the host of a podcast called Psychedelia. He's got a website called The Third Wave, thethirdwave.co. He's kind of laying out this concept of us being in the third wave of psychedelic use, and we'll get into that in the show. Super fun conversation, great guy, really pushing to get a lot more exposure on the psychedelic world and positive momentum for the movement as a whole, which is really exciting. I think you guys will really like the show, and just let us know what you think. You can reach out to us at in Psychedelics Today, email at gmail.com. We also have a contact form on the site. You can hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. All the info is on our site, Psychedelics Today. So if you want to support the show, hit us up on iTunes with a review, or just give us some stars, or tell your friends about the show. Really appreciate you guys spreading the word. We're growing really well. We're about 27,000 downloads now, and it's only been a handful of months, and it's pretty awesome. If any of you are going to be at Psychedelic Science in Oakland, let us know. We'd love to meet up, say hi. We'll probably try to have some sort of gear on us or colors or something that says Psychedelics Today, so you can kind of recognize us in the crowd, because there's going to be a gazillion people there. And I think that's it. Enjoy the show. Talk to you later. Love you. Bye. Paul Austin, thanks for joining us on Psychedelics Today.
Thanks for having me on here. It's a pleasure to meet you guys and get to know you guys and do this interview.
Yeah, I really can't wait to dig in. So we found you online. You have a really cool podcast called Third or Psychedelia. Thirdwave.co is your website. And go ahead.
And those are kind of, the third wave is more or less the brand or the big idea. It talks about this idea of we're in the third wave of psychedelics, with the first wave being indigenous use of psychedelics for, thousands of years all over the world in more tribal ceremonies. The second wave being, the oncoming of the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, and then the third wave being now. And, third wave is a term that's used in other contexts as well. Third wave feminism, third wave coffee. The way that it kind of came to be was I was in Budapest, walking around with a couple friends, and we had microdosed on that day in particular, and we were trying to come up with an idea of a website to start where we could provide high quality information for people about these substances. And we were going to all these third wave coffee spots, and we were talking about psychedelics, and one of my friends was like, hey, why not make it the third wave of psychedelics? Checked it later, and it all kind of put together and made sense. So the explanation came after the fact. The initial name just happened to be kind of a random collation of two things that we were imbibing at the time.
I had I was at this conference, Horizons, in like what was it? Like 2009 or something. Pinchbeck was there, talking about a similar concept, but he only called it like a second initiation, like a second planetary initiation, where we're like taking what we learned from the 60s and we now have a more informed approach. But yours even includes I'm sure he meant it to include the indigenous stuff, but that's not the way it came off when I was listening.
And Pinchbeck just released this new book, How Soon Is Now.
Do you have a copy of it?
It just came in the
amazing.
Mail yesterday. I read through the first couple chapters last night. I was just going to get through a little bit more today. And, he talks about also from that context and that perspective of initiation. Obviously, initiations have played a huge role in, tribal places all over the globe. And of course, one of those initiations is psychedelics and visionary plants and entheogens.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating book. We hope to have him on, I think, next month.
Great.
How did you kind of get inspired by microdosing or psychedelics in general to want to start doing this project?
Yeah, I think for me, my experience, like many other people, started with psychedelics when I was 19. I was a sophomore in college. I had tried cannabis and had been smoking cannabis for maybe 3 years up to that point. And I had a close friend of mine, the same guy who, I went out and smoked cannabis with for the first time. A few years later is like, well, let's try some mushrooms. So I was living in a fraternity house at the time, and it was winter break. And for winter break, everyone goes home. So the campus is completely deserted and no one's really there. So my dad happened to work at that university. And although all the buildings, even the fraternity house that I was living in, were like closed and shut off and locked, I made up an excuse about why I, had to go back into the fraternity house to get X, Y, and Z. And my dad was like, "Sure, okay, no problem." So he found out the door code, got me in, and then when I left, the back door stuck like a little bottle in the back door, and so my two friends and I then, like, later that night, we snuck in the back door of the fraternity house and then ate mushrooms in the basement, and had a really just like weird time. Like it was just odd. Like when you do psychedelics for the first time, you're kind of like, what's going on? Why do I feel so nostalgic? Why do I feel so sensitive? Why are things moving in my visions? And I was really kind of curious about it and really interested in it. And so about 4 or 5 months later, I had an opportunity to try LSD. And I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. So I took a couple doses, and where I'm from in West Michigan, it's like the third coast is what they call it, because we have Great Lakes up around here. And Lake Michigan, it's basically like living on an ocean. And we have these amazing sand dunes that span pretty much the entire length of the Lake Michigan coastline. And so I went out there with friends on 2 doses, and it was a sunny, beautiful, like early May day. And I had like that, experience of bliss and that like understanding of how everything is connected, and like how I'm connected to trees, which are connected to the ground, which get energy from, X, Y, and Z, and had this amazing experience. And I was like, there is something about this. So what I did as a stupid 19-year-old is a few weeks later, I flew to Tanzania in Africa. And I was there on a school trip. I was studying biology at the time because I was pre-med, and the focus of the trip was like a safari, basically. So we went on safari in Tanzania, in the Serengeti, the Ngorongoro crater, a few other places for like a couple weeks in total. And I thought it would be a really good idea to take some LSD with me on that trip. Of course. I mean, you're on safari.
Yeah, why not?
Why wouldn't you do that? So obviously it's very easy to travel with. So I just kind of threw a little bit in my like a digital camera container, took it on the trip, and then was like kind of hooked in ever since. And so when I started doing these psychedelics and I was 19 and 20, it also happened to come at a time in my life where I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was very undecided. At first, I had studied medicine in college. I was pre-med. I also had played soccer, so that was very stressful. And so I decided to kind of do away with the medicine track, study history and business. And I was going through this transition at the time. And so when I was using psychedelics in that context and thinking about these big picture things, like, what do I want to do with my life? Like, what do I want to have a career in? These questions that we start to ask our junior, senior year of college that happen to coincide with a lot of the values that I just learned from having amazing, blissful LSD experiences, outside when it's 70 degrees and sunny at the beach. And because of that, because of those two, basically those coincided, I thought about missions, and I made the decision that when I graduated from school, I wanted to do something that was more unconventional. And I had always been fairly unconventional growing up. I never really wanted to listen to what other people told me to do. I always fell asleep in the classes that I hated in high school and would only pay attention to the ones that I liked or that were challenging. And that trend kind of continue to consolidate until I got to the point where I was like, well, fuck it. I'm just going to move abroad and I'm going to teach English. So I started teaching English. I was living in Turkey for about a year teaching there. And I wanted to do more. I wanted to do more. I heard about this guy named Tim Ferris who had wrote this book called The 4-Hour Workweek. And with the ability that the internet gives us to leverage technology in a way, entrepreneurship, starting your own thing, like what we're both doing right now, is way more accessible. All you need to do is learn a few marketing skills. And all of a sudden, if you can do X, Y, and Z, if you can code, if you can teach, if you can whatever it is, and you know how to market yourself, well, then you can kind of pay for what you want to do around the world. And so I started my own business online soon after that in like August 2014. And that was basically like an online language school. And I worked on that very hard for about a year and a half, got it to a point where it was doing okay. And I decided to take on another project. And so because of all of those experiences that I had when I was younger, I knew that I was, whether I knew it consciously or whether I knew it subconsciously, I knew I was in a position of relative privilege where I could actually come out and start like a psychedelic website and actually not be afraid of any type of major repercussions because of my income or because of my family situation or because, you know, my friends. It was just, I have income from this other project. I can travel and live wherever I want. Let's start a website about something that means a lot to me and, you know, that has a viable business model going forward because of this resurgence in psychedelics that we're seeing. So I think that's kind of the long arc of things in terms of why I decided to start that website. And I think specifically in terms of focusing on microdosing, you know, the focal point of what I'm trying to do at the Third Wave, what we're trying to do at the Third Wave, is we're trying to change the cultural dialogue around psychedelic use. And, you know, there's a lot of great science and research coming out right now about psychedelics from Johns Hopkins, from NYU, supported by organizations like MAPS and Hefter. But the people who work in those organizations or the researchers who are doing the research, they don't have a lot of leverage in terms of like pushing the cultural conversation because they have to be worried about the kind of the backlash, right?
Right.
And so they need other people from a cultural perspective to start having these grassroots conversations and start changing minds to do that. So we thought, well, why not? I thought, why not start a website that has that purpose and that idea. And I saw microdosing specifically as being in this really interesting gap where it acts as this kind of bridge between what's going on in the psychedelic fringe and all the kind of the renaissance that we're seeing in the psychedelic fringe and a lot of the issues that are happening from a mainstream cultural perspective. And microdosing is doing a really excellent job of bridging those, which is helping to bring psychedelic use into the mainstream cultural conversation. And so if the objective for me is to change the cultural conversation, I look at the most effective way to do that. And I think that's talking about microdosing, initially, at least.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it, man. Especially when you can tie in money and creativity, problem solving into it.
Yeah, again,
it's a huge topic too.
To those people. Go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to say it's a huge topic now, especially. I mean, there's articles coming out with the tech booms, and I read the microdosing ebook that you have up on your site, and what did it say? Like 40% of Level C corporation employees are microdosing in the Silicon Valley. I mean.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like the number of people who do this and who just, you know, a lot of them just don't talk about it.
Right.
A lot of them, it's kind of like, I think psychedelics is one of those best kept secrets, you know, or not even necessarily a secret in Silicon Valley, but from everyone else that like, yeah, we're doing these things. They're fucking awesome. And, you know, now I think because the research is coming out to back some of the psychedelics, I think more people feel comfortable in openly discussing it with media outlets like Rolling Stone and, you know, like the New York Times and all these major publications that are bringing out pieces about it.
Yeah, I'm wondering, have you done any research like when this microdosing wave kind of started? Because I mean, it seems like, you know, that area, the West Coast, California, it's always had that psychedelic history. I wonder if it's something that just started springing up recently, or if it's always kind of been there since we're talking about it always kind of being there.
I bet it started at that Stanford AI Labs, the SAIL group, but I don't know. What do you think, Paul?
When was that? Was that in the 60s that was the case?
The peak of the computer revolution and psychedelic revolution. Fadiman was in that same valley at the same time. Palo Alto, I think.
Yeah, and it could have started as early as that. I was speaking to a guy a couple weeks ago who runs like these ayahuasca mastermind retreats. And he was telling me that he knows people who have been microdosing for like 20, 25 years in Silicon Valley. So I think it probably has been going on quite a long time. I would imagine there are people who have, you know, like Jim Fadiman, who has been in Menlo Park a long time. since the 60s, probably people up until that time, but it really only hit even like fringe awareness when Jim published the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide in 2011, and he dedicated an entire chapter to it. And then soon after that, so that book was published in 2011. In early 2015, Jim was on the Tim Ferris podcast.
Right.
And he spoke about microdosing on the Tim Ferris podcast. And soon after that, we started to see the articles from Rolling Stone and Wired and places like that. So it seems like everything else Tim Ferris seems to get his hands on, he acts as an amplifier for some of these more fringe things that actually hold a lot of legitimacy. And so I think when Jim then went on that podcast and started to talk about it, then that's when it got in, like it was much more open about what was going on in Silicon Valley and elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting timing, and just to watch it expand. And I'm right there with you. I listened to that interview right when it came out. I was like, oh, okay, this is probably going to be a big thing really soon. But, I bet in the Bay Area, it had even expanded to pretty serious market penetration right around that time, and then just blew up even more afterwards.
Yeah, and I think, this is a conversation that a lot of people then are having about microdosing is it this white elitist tech, type hacking with Soylent and the singularity type shit? And I think it is to some degree, but I was talking about this with Neil Goldsmith, who we have both interviewed for our podcasts. And I was asking him this question, basically, is it all bad that we have these kind of white elitist capitalist people who are supposedly taking microdosing for productivity? And, what he said to me made a lot of sense. He's like, it's probably just very hygienic. And he uses hygienic in an interesting context. Hygienic in terms of it helps us to kind of shed, shed the trauma, shed the shit, shed all this kind of cultural indoctrination and conditioning that we're exposed to, and actually get in touch with a little bit of that soul that we have. And I think this is something that then I write about as well, and I've thought about is, supposedly these people are doing it within, a productivity, capitalist oriented context. At the same time, there are probably these maybe unintended side effects that come from microdosing, just being more conscious, being more aware of what's going on, understanding that there's more kind of connection to nature and other people. And so I think that is something that frustrates me sometimes about the way that microdosing is often talked about in certain psychedelic circles.
I've heard you say before too that it even kind of sets the stage for, what is a real dose like? See, yeah. I was lied to my whole life about this drug, so maybe it's actually kind of neat or helpful in other ways, or just pleasurable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, because I think that is a viable question. What is an appropriate dose, right? What is an appropriate dose for most people? And an appropriate dose for most people might just be 10 micrograms of LSD. It might not be 100 or 150 or 250 or 500. Maybe people don't need a heroic dose to really get these effects that we're seeing from microdosing.
Yeah. And this is the first time I think we're talking about microdosing on the show. So do you want to give us an example of what a microdose is for people that aren't familiar with it, like the dosage?
Yeah, so a microdose is the idea of microdosing. It does not come from psychedelics. It actually just comes from using medication in a subtherapeutic dose. And so when we talk about it then from a psychedelic perspective, it's an amount of a psychedelic that you take that is subperceptual, meaning that you don't perceive any noticeable changes, meaning, sometimes when we take psychedelics like a museum dose, 50 mics or 75 mics, we kind of notice our sense of touch is enhanced. We feel this really deep appreciation for life and nature around us. Our sense of smell is enhanced, all those things. With a microdose, you don't feel any of that. At least you're not supposed to when you take it. And the idea with a microdose then is you take it a couple times a week for an extended period of time. after you have been microdosing for some time, you start to notice some of these benefits that we associate with higher dose experiences. And so from a more specific perspective, LSD would be, microdose would be between like 6 and probably 15 to 20 micrograms. For magic mushrooms, it would be between probably 0.2 and 0.5 milligrams of magic mushroom. And I think for like iboga, people do between 4 and 6 milligrams. And so with that, then like usually I'll tell people start low when you're microdosing and kind of build up, because as we've seen some of these stories online, like people are taking a microdose and then they're going to work and tripping out. Well, you didn't take a microdose. You did that wrong. You fucked it up.
Well, for something like blotter, do you have any way to really know what type of dose that you're taking? I think Fadiman probably gets that into his book, right? Or do you have any resources of that in your ebook that you have online?
I think, yeah, we do. Yeah. And we just, this guy who writes content for us, Patrick Smith, who's fantastic. He also runs the blog, The Psychedelic Scientist. He just wrote me up a little thing about volumetric LSD microdosing. And we're going to publish that and tuck it in, I think, to our guides and whatnot. And that's just, if you have blotter paper, how do you then, volumetrically microdose with LSD so it's as accurate as possible? Because when I've done it in the past, I did it with like white on white blotter paper, and I'm indifferent to the exact amount I take. Sometimes I take a little too much, which is perfectly fine. It's like my friend sent me this message the other day. He lives in Portugal. He's German. And he's like, that feeling when you cut off just a little bit too much of a microdose, it's going to be a good day, So like, just cutting it off on blotter paper is okay. But if you want very exact, precise, which I think is important, especially for people who are doing it from like a medical perspective, because they should understand, okay, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. If I do it at 5 micrograms or 10 micrograms, is this having an effect, or do I need to go higher? So people should check that out on our site. We can provide maybe that in the show notes or something.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I always think about that from like harm reduction, because now there's like articles coming out, and then Isla Walden is her name. She came up with that book. It was so weird. My uncle came over. He's like, "Oh man, I heard this lady talking about microdosing with LSD to get rid of her depression and this and that." It's like, oh man, and he's kind of like conservative, and I was like, wow, it's really reaching mainstream like people, and yeah, it's just like if people are interested in doing that, I always kind of think of the harm reduction approach and be like, well, you don't want to take a little too much and then have an experience you weren't really ready for. So I think information is important.
It is, and it's good to provide that support. And, I obviously, from both a legal but also just a common sense perspective, I don't necessarily promote. We're not telling people to do microdosing. We're not telling people to try microdosing. I think it's way more effective than pharmaceuticals. Absolutely. Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications and ADHD medications, that shit is toxic. Microdosing is better than that. However, it's also a Schedule I substance, when you're talking about this. So from just an information perspective, it's like you're saying, harm reduction is important.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like the next wave of the drug war. Like, these people all want to work better and produce more value for their employers or whatever. Like, let's cut off that drug supply. Can't be letting people be productive. Like, have you had any speculations about what that looks like? As like a response to microdosing specifically, even comically. It's okay if it's not serious.
I have a serious thought. I can share a serious thought. I'm publishing an article fairly soon on Symposia about microdosing, and I talk about this in the article. I think ultimately microdosing will act as a bulwark against a backlash. Mm-hmm. I think it because the next backlash, like you're saying, isn't going to be, we need to eliminate all these drugs to make our, people more productive and blah, 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 blah. only because obviously the deep state that, you know, controls a lot of what happens in government and big corporations and whatnot, that is important to kind of continuing their status quo. And so I think that will then act as an interesting bulwark. Am I pronouncing that right? Bulwark?
I try not to use that one.
Okay, I need to stop using words I can't pronounce. It's a huge mistake. So using that, I think it will help to normalize psychedelic use with people who wouldn't normally be comfortable with it. And I think because there are so many tech people and people of economic value who have either microdosed or just used psychedelics, I think that will also probably lend some credence to like an eventual, like a mitigation of an eventual backlash.
Right. Like how many engineers do you really want to put in jail?
Yeah, like
it's not a good
run
idea.
The system somehow.
You take out like half of a Microsoft Office or something. You're like, Bill Gates might get a little upset.
Yeah. Well, apparently that hasn't stopped other people yet. But yeah, that is it. Well, and I think that brings up a viable question as well. It's like, how much do these people really care about psychedelics? So I think this is something that, you know, people in the psychedelic fringe, we kind of rest our hat on is, you know, we're hoping that when we maybe get to a push for medicalization or full legalization, which will be probably 10 or 15 years still at least, you know, I think people in the psychedelic world look at, you know, those who are actually using psychedelics in Silicon Valley or other entrepreneurs, will they really care enough about the more social implications of psychedelics and like the social right issues and human rights issues and, you know, like minimizing suffering to, you know, put their neck out there in defense of it. And I don't know if that's the case necessarily.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
Yeah, I always come back to, well, I guess since we're talking about, you know, this in corporations in Silicon Valley and how psychedelics are somewhat accepted in that, and then coming back to we're three white men having a podcast about psychedelics and being able to openly talk about it. I just always come back to this like privilege topic. What do you think about that, Paul?
Like the topic of privilege within the psychedelic community specifically?
Yeah, and I think in your interview with Ayelet, she said she wrote the book because she was in this privileged position to get the information out there without getting like a lot of backlash. And, you know, we're in this privileged position and she used that quote from Spider-Man with like great power, responsibility or whatever.
Great power comes great responsibility. Uncle Ben saves the day. Like that's right before he dies in the movie, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sad day.
So it's like, yeah, is it our job like to use this privilege and power to talk about this stuff, or I don't know. It's one of those.
Yeah, privilege is an interesting thing. You know, our job, if you mean by that, like white men who are interested or enthusiastic about this topic, maybe, yes. I think this, you know, we can approach this from multiple perspectives. We can approach it from an identity politics perspective in terms of one of the major ways that we're going to normalize psychedelic use and destigmatize psychedelic use is just by having conversations with our family about it, having conversations with our friends about it, having conversations with people in our community about it, and engaging with those conversations with the understanding that the person that you're talking to might not agree with you. And how do you engage in that conversation? How do you do it respectfully and responsibly where you can engage the person so that they can ask you questions and not just shut you out immediately? And I think as white adult men, if you can't have a conversation with a family member or your friends because you're too ashamed or because you're embarrassed or scared, then that might be an issue or something that you need to reconsider about yourself. I think if you're in a position where you're so concerned about what other people might think of you, then, you know, maybe look at it from a different perspective and say, hey, there are people suffering who need these things. And it's, if I care about these things, you know, these psychedelics, if I'm enthusiastic about it, then let's have these conversations with people. Now, you know, there are also plenty of people who obviously they can't talk to certain friends about it. They can't talk to the wider community about it. For example, I know a number of women who work in schools who use psychedelics, and they're probably not going to just come out right in the open and say they use them, because they could likely be fired since they're working with children. Right. So from that perspective, I think, we definitely are in a privileged position. And, the privileged position that Ayelet was speaking about was specifically because of her race, and not because of necessarily even her socioeconomic background, although that obviously plays a huge part as well. But, those who are minorities, Blacks and Hispanics and probably indigenous people as well, Native Americans, they are disproportionately punished for drug offenses, including psychedelic use. And so, I think the point that Ayelet was making was, if she was like a Black male and she wrote this book, there might be trouble at her, right? There might be trouble at her door. So I think, it's our cross to bear, so to say, if I want to steal a phrase from Christianity. It's our cross to bear. It's a sacrifice that I think is important to make, and it's a burden that I think is important to have on our shoulders, because the burden in our society has been pushed on others for far too long and at far too high a cost. And it's about time we start sharing that burden equally, and I think openly discussing psychedelics in a way that is responsible and in a way that is informative and in a way that is engaging is, I think, critical with our position of privilege.
I totally agree with that. It's as scary as it is to step out into what you might perceive as the line of fire. It is really almost a privilege to be able to do it, like an honor to do it. And another thing I was going to say, it was like not being able to have that conversation, or like, you go do a public talk somewhere and somebody starts raging. How do you engage with that rager? I just finished this book, Nonviolent Communication. You guys have heard of it, but really, really interesting, and I think really insightful for how you could engage those people, because he's more talking about warring tribal factions and really rough familial situations. But if you're dealing with somebody out in public and you make them feel heard and understood, like, you could really progress that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's becoming like a point of compassion and understanding and non-judgment. Right.
Absolutely.
And I think that is usually the best way to engage with people. I mean, when I first told my mom that I'd done psychedelics, I'm fairly young as it is. I'm 26, and this was about 2.5 years ago, and she flipped out, basically. Totally freaked out. And my dad was cool about it. Not cool about it, but he was like, yeah, all right, didn't really freak out, but my mom did. But what happens when you have conversations with other people is cognitive dissonance happens, because how they've been conditioned to think about psychedelics goes in opposition to how they perceive you as an individual. So obviously, as a culture, we've been conditioned to think of psychedelics as this thing that's going to make you do hippie things. It's going to, you're not going to shower, you're not going to bathe, you're not going to work. You're going to get schizophrenia, you're going to get bipolar, you'll be useless, you'll go to a mental institute, and then you'll die an old, decrepit man at 48 years old, shitting your pants and not knowing what happened. And that's obviously so true. No, I'm just kidding. That's obviously not true at all. But, that's what people think. That's what people are conditioned to think by propaganda and by like these just say no drug shit, the stuff that we were raised on. So when I engage when I engaged my mom with it, she has to make a decision. And it might not even be a rational in my head decision. It might be a heart decision that I either have to choose to believe propaganda and the government, or I can choose to engage with my son and not necessarily buy into the concept, but be understanding enough to hear more about it and look into what some of the implications might be. And I think then when we engage those people, they always defer to the close relationship. And when you have that deference, then you can, talk about them with these things, using things like science and research to have credible points with what you're speaking about.
That's huge. Yeah. I find it really complicated to come out about it. It's funny that I can do this on the internet.
Have you come out about it? Obviously you have come out about it, but do your friends and family and people in your personal life know about it?
I would say, more than half my family and anybody I'm friends with that I can talk to on a regular basis, you know. They know that I'm doing this project. They know that I've used drugs, and they're familiar with my breathwork stuff. So it's coming out like twisting the conversation 5 degrees more with, you know, parents, you know. I'm pretty sure my parents know what's going on in my life, but, you know, just like opening up and going, oh, you know, yeah, all your suspicions are true. Sorry. But, you know, that kind of thing, it's kind of tricky, but,
it is. Well, why is it tricky? Why would
exactly?
You say
I don't know. It's because I'm playing out that stigma shame thing. Like, I don't want, you know, somebody to think differently of me because of it, and, you know, have something weird happen in the relationship. Who knows? I think it's something to do with growing up in the Northeast and being kind of like, you know, repressed about everything. But, you know, recovering repressed person here.
We're all recovering repressed people.
Yeah. And then one of the tricky things is, you know, I do work in software. So like it does put my professional career at risk doing this project and talking about this stuff. So it's like, you know, maybe it would be a good thing if I got canned, but because I could spend more time advocating and doing breath work with people and that kind of stuff. So, you know, perhaps that's the right move, but, you know, I would rather keep that income to fund the show and other projects, and for now.
Yeah, it's small changes, right? I mean, what you're talking about basically is small changes, and I think with when we have conversations with family, when we have conversations with friends, you know, a lot of us who have these really amazing experiences with psychedelics, you know, you want to shout it from the top of a mountain as loud as you can to everyone who can hear, and then you find out that shit just doesn't work.
No,
it does not work. Like, fuck. So you have to kind of change your strategy, right? And so, I mean, I think patience, right, is the key. Like, all things will happen in due time, as long as you have that intention kind of at the end of the road.
Yeah, I saw somebody give a presentation about using MDMA at Horizons, and I think they were like a relationship or life coach, and they were saying how their family members were seeing such changes in them, like a little bit more happier, their social life was maybe growing and their professional life was growing, and they were so curious, like what just happened to that person? And, you know, when they finally came out, they're like, I've been using MDMA, and, you know, and then, you know, kind of got this curiosity going. And I think that kind of happened with my parents too, and my mom. It was really interesting because, you know, she comes from like that propaganda. It was like people were jumping out of windows when I was a kid from taking too much acid. And then I came around to, she knew I was doing breath work and randomly called me one day and was like, my friend wants me to go to this breathwork thing in Massachusetts, and I thought like you did something along the lines of that. And I was like, is it with a guy named Stan Groff? And she's like, that sounds really familiar. I was like, you got to go. And ever since she came back from that experience, she's been so open about it. And it's like, I think, you know, this is a really interesting field, because I just started laughing. It's like, my mom is just going to sit in front of Stan and listen to his clinical research of LSD back in the 50s, and she's going to be like probably terrified. But totally, I think changed some of her views around.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know if was the workshop just holotropic breath work, or, you know, did Stan openly talk about like his work with LSD and how it influenced?
Yeah, usually like the beginning Friday nights, he goes into how he developed breath work and some of his background. And so when I did a workshop with him, it was like Friday night was him talking about his clinical research in Prague. And, you know, and then when my mom went, you know, I'm sure it's the same thing. I just was like laughing inside. And it's like, you know, everything I was trying to educate my mom about with the science that's coming out, I'm like, now she's going to be sitting in front of a psychiatrist telling her this stuff. And then also having an experience with a non-ordinary state through breathing. And yeah, it was interesting, but definitely a little bit more open-minded about it now.
And so have you had conversations with her like about psychedelics or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I when I was in my undergrad, I was doing some psychedelic studies, and obviously based around breath work. And I wanted to go to the Psychedelic Science Conference, and this was after she did the breathwork session. And I told her I was creating an independent study with it, and you know, I was going to go out there and get credit. And she was totally on board, and she's like, "Wow, yeah, this is, you know, go do it." I think it was like, and I think it was her breathwork experience, and also hearing like a respectable psychiatrist talk about like the profound changes and healing that these substances have. But I'm not trying to talk on your word, Mom, if you're listening.
No, and I think that speaks to an important part of how we build legitimacy for what's going on. Is Aldous Huxley had conversations with Timothy Leary back in the early '60s when Huxley was doing like a visiting lecture series at MIT, and this was when Timothy Leary had just started at Harvard, and they went to dinner one night. And they had a conversation about, the future of psychedelics and where LSD was going. And basically, Huxley was like, we should probably keep this to, the intelligentsia, to the politicians, to these people who are, from a hierarchical perspective at the top of society. And we should let it trickle down, so to say. And Timothy Leary was kind of, I think, like, was in agreement with him at that time. And then obviously things changed from that perspective. Him and Ken Kesey kind of blew the door open on then all that stuff that happened with LSD. And so I think when we look at what's going on now, I think that's one of the most important lessons that we learn is the world, in a way, the 60s weren't ready for all the drugs that were dumped on them. And it had a lot of great long-term implications, like positive, like the environmental movement and like kind of the inculcation of more like therapeutic values from a society-wide perspective. But obviously it also led to a tremendous backlash against all drugs, and we're now kind of obviously still dealing with those repercussions. And so when we look at going forward, how we change that, this kind of comes back to this conversation about microdosing. Is if you're having all the top business and economic leaders who are using psychedelics, that's pretty powerful and that's pretty profound. And that's also a significant change from what was going on in the 60s, where business leaders were much more conventional. The future is Silicon Valley, and the future of our economic situation the fact of our future economic situation is that most of those leaders will have done psychedelics at some point or have gone to Burning Man. Elon Musk is known for going to Burning Man. That's powerful. That's very powerful. And I think that gives us hope then for more legitimacy moving forward.
Yeah. How do you see this third wave riding out?
Yeah, that's a great pun. That's a great question. Is that that's a great question. So I think there are obviously going to be two major movements. There's going to be first the research oriented movement, which we're already seeing. It is likely, barring any authoritarianism in the United States and kind of the onslaught of a possible dictatorship, barring that, and if things just stay somewhat normal, MDMA will likely be medicalized for PTSD by 2021, and psilocybin will likely be medicalized for depression also by 2021 is what they're thinking. And I think that's going to be the first major movement of the third wave. It's kind of the third wave is just getting started. I think that will be kind of going towards its apex is when we first medicalize MDMA and psilocybin, and that's largely because as a country, as a nation, the United States has a mental illness epidemic. Right. There's a lot of fucked up shit that goes on because we've had this for-profit pharmaceutical system that has basically dictated the way people dictated a lot of people's health. We've had an economic system that has prioritized money over wellness. And part of that is how we've treated things like depression and ADHD and bipolar and PTSD. The fact is we don't have any effective ways to treat the root cause of those things. We have ways to manage them, treat the symptoms, so to say, but even those are quite ineffective. 15 million people have treatment-resistant depression in the United States. That means they've tried things and nothing has worked. And so I think when you basically, if we're going to be facilitating, for example, ceremonies, magic mushroom ceremonies for 15 million people to help them deal with the depression, I think that's going to be one of the first major movements. Same with PTSD. America has been fighting wars for a long time, and we have a lot of veterans. And, you know, one of the strongest groups supporting marijuana legalization is a veterans group, because they realize that this medicine is needed for people who come back from the war and can't adjust to society, who have PTSD. MDMA is 3 to 4 times as effective as regular talk therapy for PTSD. Regular talk therapy is about 20% effective. MDMA is like, you know, depending on the trial, I think 60 to 70% effective. That's also going to be huge. And I think once that happens, that's going to kind of open up the floodgates for then having more and more conversations about the eventual legalization of psychedelics for recreation and for, you know, going on hikes with friends and for those things. I think it's still going to be 10 or 15 years, but as a culture, just like we did with marijuana, you know, medical marijuana was first legal in California in 1996. In 2012, Colorado and was it Colorado and Oregon or Washington?
It's a great question. I don't remember.
I think it was Washington. Colorado and Washington legalized recreational in 2012. That's a span of about 16 years. We'll probably see something similar with psychedelics. Once they become medicalized, there'll probably be conversations about full legalization within 5 to 10 years. And that's for 2 reasons. I think one, just it's futile to wage a war on drugs. And I think we're recognizing that more and more. We can't, as a society, we don't have the economic output anymore to wage a war on drugs. So I think that's going to be part of it. And with that, hopefully will also be the legalization of all drugs so that they can be controlled and regulated, and we can provide the support system necessary to handle the negative aspects of drug use. You know, they happen regardless. It's better to manage them than to leave them to a black market. And then I think the second thing that will happen is, they will be legalized because of all these tremendous benefits that we're seeing, in terms of openness, in terms of creativity, in terms of getting clarity on what an individual needs, in terms of recreation and whatever it might be. You know, it's really not that difficult to create a system. Ken Tupper, he works for the British Columbia provincial government. He spoke at Horizons this past year. He also has spoken at the World Ayahuasca Conference. He wrote an excellent paper about the eventual legalization of psychedelics and what that might look like. And it's an excellent read, fairly academic, but still worth going through. And he basically lays out the case for this is how we create a society that reintegrates visionary states that create reverence and awe and mystery for educational purposes, both from, you know, a more mainstream educational perspective, but also just generally like learning perspective. And so I think that will then be the other model that will be used, is because these are excellent substances for personal growth and personal development.
Can you speak at all about the state of decriminalization in Portugal, since you live there and have some friends there?
Yeah, I mean, the state of decriminalization is all substances are decriminalized. So everything is decriminalized. And they did that specifically because in the 90s, Portugal was going through a heroin epidemic, just like we're going through now in the United States, you know, and it's more like an opioid epidemic, but obviously heroin is part of that, as is fentanyl and some of these other really fucked up opiates.
Right.
And so Portugal was like, you know, we can't have this anymore. We need to do something that is pragmatic to deal with the problem. So they decriminalized all drugs. They treated drugs as a societal issue rather than criminalizing it like it needs to be punished. They said it's going to happen. We're going to provide the support system for it. So now if you get like caught with heroin, they send you to a therapist, and that therapist asks you a number of questions to determine if you might be a repeat user or not. And they continue that process then for if you get caught with heroin or other substances. So it's interesting because Portugal traditionally has been a very conservative place. It's extremely conservative. And this is why Europe just has weird drug laws, because like Scandinavia, which is like super liberal and like super egalitarian and like, you know, like women have tons of rights and like everyone is equal, but drugs are bad and terrible and awful. And if you get caught with them, you go to jail for like years. Whereas
the
Portugal,
strangest conversation with a Swedish lady last winter about it, and I blew my mind. I was like, "Are you serious? What?"
It's weird. It doesn't make sense because you go to Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, like everyone speaks perfect English. They're all extremely well educated. Yet it's like something didn't shift right, when it came to drugs. Whereas you have like Portugal and Spain, conservative, Catholic. Like if you go out with a girl, there's probably very little chance she's going to go home with you the first night, like that type of culture, and yet they're having all these open conversations about like, drugs. In Spain, magic mushrooms are decriminalized. Cannabis is decriminalized. They have cannabis clubs in Barcelona. In Portugal, all drugs are decriminalized. And it's a weird dichotomy, and I'd actually be curious to like research more about why that is. And so in Portugal, there's like a laxness about drugs, but like the only drugs that people use in Portugal are like MDMA for the most part. Like there's not a ton of people necessarily use psychedelics. Not even a ton of people necessarily smoke cannabis. Like it's a solid amount, but like I lived there for 4 months and it was difficult at times to find cannabis, like when I wanted to smoke it. Yet, they do have these decriminalization policies. And what's great for what is so great for the drug world, the international drug world, is the prime minister who, the guy who was prime minister of Portugal when they passed all these decriminalization laws. He is now the head secretary general of the UN. And so he has probably a lot of influence in terms of that drug conversation, especially as the United States is continuing to lose legitimacy in the eyes of the international world when it comes to drugs.
And their own citizenry.
Yeah, that as well.
I'm really curious, or Kyle, before we jump off that, anything you want to throw into the Portugal, Europe discussion?
No, but I guess like Amsterdam, that was always like a really interesting place because they have smart shops and you go in there and just buy mushrooms.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they sold dry at some point, right? They were legal.
Yeah, they did. Now it's only like truffles that are legal. They made fresh mushrooms illegal in 2008.
Right.
The Dutch have always been, though, fairly liberal. Like prostitution has been legal there for years and years and years. They have this show on their public television. Okay, the show is on their public television. It's called Drugs and Sex. On their public television.
Sounds nice.
And yeah, so like they're fairly liberal, but they also they have a really weird policy about cannabis because you can go into all these shops and you can buy cannabis, but it's illegal for people to sell cannabis to the shops.
Huh. Yeah. How does that work?
I don't know, but they're illegally selling the cannabis at the shops, and then the coffee shops can legally sell it to whoever wants to come in and buy it. So that's also like things about the drug war don't make sense.
Yeah. And they had a drop in cannabis use, I think, too, once they started opening up those coffee shops. And
yeah, not
kids
a lot
didn't
of
care.
People.
It wasn't cool.
No. Yeah, not a lot of Dutch people smoke weed. It's like less than 5%, maybe.
Yeah, it was all like the tourists that would come over there.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a huge, that's one of the worst parts about being in Amsterdam is like tons of people there who are just there to smoke weed, which is fine, but like tourists in general, they bug me a little bit, but that's another bone pick.
So new exciting frontiers in the legal landscape. I don't know how new this is, but I'm really interested to hear about your time in Jamaica, doing some mushroom retreat work with some folks.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. I think that is also very interesting. Obviously, with these substances, mushrooms and ayahuasca, ibogaine, peyote, the legal kind of whether they're legal or not, it depends on the jurisdiction. Obviously, LSD is like illegal everywhere. MDMA is illegal everywhere. So you can't be getting your hands on those molecules. But with these visionary plant substances that grow from the ground, it's ridiculous enough that we've tried to make them illegal in any perspective, but they are illegal in most countries. In the United States, you can get psilocybin spores. except in Idaho, Georgia, and California. You can't have psilocybin spores in those 3 states, but the other ones you can, and you can grow your own mushrooms then, but it's illegal to grow your own mushrooms, because obviously we can't handle ourselves. And, same idea in Canada, same idea in the UK. However, there are certain jurisdictions where psilocybin mushrooms are legal, and that's largely just because those governments haven't had to ever deal with an issue or a problem. There haven't been any courts or any cases that have come to court about it. They haven't had to kind of roll out any legal jurisdiction about it. It's just never been an issue, so they've never created any laws around it. And so because of that, it's likely legal in many contexts. So Jamaica is one of those places. Brazil is one of those places. The British Virgin Islands is one of those places. I was just doing research on this earlier today. Yeah. Mexico has weird rules and laws around psilocybin as well. But Jamaica is one of those places. And Jamaica is also very close to the United States, obviously. It's like I flew from Montego Bay in Jamaica to Charlotte. It's like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that.
It's just right on the other side of Cuba, so extremely
just
close.
Right. Extremely close. Yeah, super close. And so, with this rise in interest that we're seeing in psychedelics from a cultural perspective, and with the complete and total failure of the pharmaceutical companies to address mental illness, people are turning to what works. And there are a lot of people who are in a position where they can afford to fly to Jamaica or Mexico or Costa Rica or the Amazon with this growth in ayahuasca and do these ceremonies. And so a lot of these retreats so far have been specifically oriented around ayahuasca, oftentimes within a cultural context of, the Amazonia. And while ayahuasca is great, I'd prefer to trip and not puke my brains out. Thank you very much. So,
I kind of like the puking, but yeah, I got you.
It makes me feel like there's real work going on, real energy going on. Right? Getting those demons out of my stomach. Actually, I have this friend of mine who was in Jamaica with me who was like, the only reason that tobacco is in the ayahuasca, and tobacco is oftentimes the purgative, is it doesn't actually add anything to the ayahuasca experience. That's actually based in like a cultural Amazonian obsession with needing to purge. From a Western perspective, to actually have the psychedelic experience, apparently you don't even necessarily need to purge. This is according to him. I haven't checked it. I haven't checked my Wikipedia sources, but this is apparently the case. So anyway, getting back to these retreats in Jamaica, there's a guy named Erik Osbourne who runs this site Myco Meditations, and he's been facilitating these retreats down there for about 3 years now. And I had kind of staked out his website maybe 6 months ago. I was like, I need to contact this guy. I want to get in touch with this guy. And just as it is, he kind of had sent me like a message on Twitter or something. And I'm like, yes, awesome. So I sent him a mail. We got on a call. We had a mutual friend, Jonathan Thompson, who's also a mutual friend of ours, runs the Psychedelic Parenting Podcast. Jonathan vouched for me, and I went down on this retreat with Erik and Jonathan, and then this other guy, Omar, who is also just an incredible person. And we facilitated a retreat then for 9 people, eight of whom were like 45 and older, and who had reached a point in their life where, for whatever reason, some of them it was because of trauma, neglect, addiction. Others were just genuinely curious about this substance. They were like, "That's interesting. Psilocybin is legal in Jamaica. Okay, let's book a flight to Jamaica. Spend a week in paradise. Like this place I was at was paradise. 3,000 people, small sleepy village on the southern coast of Jamaica. Everyone's really nice and friendly. There's no crime. Beautiful beaches, and just spent a week there. Did 3 psilocybin ceremonies, and for all these people, it was their first time that they had tried psilocybin. And guess, yeah, amazing. And they all had amazing experiences. Guess how they found it? Kind of circling back to our conversation before. Guess how they found out about like psilocybin and that whole thing? If you had to guess,
through the New Yorker, or like psilocybin becoming like being researched.
Michael Pollan.
Yeah,
Michael Pollan. Trip treatment.
Really?
The article in the New Yorker.
Great article.
Yeah. Great. It was like half of them had found out about it because of that article. And this kind of circles back to the conversation we're having earlier, is where is this bridge between the psychedelic fringe and mainstream culture? Well, it comes with, people like Michael Pollan and people like Steve Jobs, who kind of spoke out about LSD. Again, people openly discussing and talking about it. Michael Pollan's next book is about psychedelics. And he's doing a residency at Harvard right now to do research for that. And that's going to be a huge book with everything that's going on. It's probably going to be bigger than The Omnivore's Dilemma, which was kind of his, kind of relationship between food and humans type thing. And so anyway, so these retreats in Jamaica are something that I'm more seriously looking at in terms of facilitating for people who are interested. And the range of individuals who would be interested in, I think, is enormous because, again, of this research that's coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. So you appreciated the work he was doing. Did he structure it in kind of like a quasi-shamanic, quasi-ceremonial way?
It was ceremonial. Yeah, it was ceremonial, but it was not shamanic in any way. He doesn't consider himself a guru by any means. He's incredibly knowledgeable about mushrooms, like the most knowledgeable person I've ever met. Ran his own like gourmet mushroom company business. And just knows so much about them and is really like passionate about them. And so we just created a space for people on the beach where, we did some prep work beforehand so they understood, the historical nature of magic mushrooms. They understood what would happen when they took the magic mushrooms. And then he recommended he made a recommendation and they took the substance and we sat on the beach and had a really wonderful, blissful experience. And he did a phenomenal job of holding that space, giving them a container to be able to explore their consciousness in a way that was safe and beautiful, because the beach that we were on at night, stars, waves crashing, just like unbelievable in itself. Even if I hadn't been on mushrooms, it still would have been amazing, So yeah, excellent job. And I think this is going to be something that people look more and more to. Is ayahuasca is nice, but we had a few people down there. Sorry, I misspoke earlier. We had one person down there who had done ayahuasca before, had never done mushrooms, but had done ayahuasca, had brought his family down to the Amazon and everything.
Jeez.
And was like, I would much rather do mushrooms compared to ayahuasca because the after result is the same, but I'm not like shitting and puking my guts out. Yeah, I'm not purging is I think more.
The diarrhea aspect is something I always overlook, but it's a substantial amount of people. I didn't have it, but like that's something that can happen. Like, the scary aspect makes people think it's better medicine, but we don't really have any evidence that it is better medicine. It's effectively orally active DMT, according to McKenna's. So,
I think the efficacy is about the same. I would imagine it would be.
That's my guess too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't have quite the clinical trials to back up that assertion. Even if it isn't exactly the same, it would be within a standard deviation, I would imagine, of the efficacy, because they're acting in similar ways. They're both tryptamines, and the way that they act on the default mode network and the way that they help, also from a psychospiritual perspective, just help us feel connected and loved and accepted. You're dealing with a lot of the same thoughts and processes, I think.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting that, I guess to make the analogy of people going to Amsterdam for cannabis, like, people are reading about this stuff and they're going out of the country. Like people are, there's a huge ayahuasca tourism down in South America. I mean, people are reading about these things and then finding it elsewhere. And I think that's also like a failure, people are doing it and it's part of human nature. And,
yeah, we will seek out things that work as part of our both personal and collective evolutionary process. We want to heal. We want to find what works. And many people in our society have enough money where they can go and fly to the Netherlands. There's another group, the Psychedelic Society of London has been facilitating experience weekends for people from London to go to Amsterdam. They just take the train over. They have a long weekend and they take truffles. Because they're illegal in the UK. Well, great. So let's just travel 3 hours, And I think, again, this just comes down to basically the failure of the state to properly handle things properly. It's a failure of the state in terms of how they handle drugs in general, where people then have to travel for them. And people will travel for them. But again, it's privileged people.
Right.
and this comes back to our conversation about privilege, is then when people go down there and they have these transformative experiences, they should talk about them, and they should talk about, tell them, talk about these experiences to their friends and family and whatnot, because there are plenty of other people who struggle with depression and PTSD and bipolar who are also on welfare and who can't afford to pay, $3,000 or $4,000 to go down there. So I think, going forward as well, just thinking about from a business perspective, I think what would be in an ideal world is create a retreat space that's almost like a nonprofit, where you invite high-end people who have the privilege to pay, and they pay more, and that covers the cost of people who are struggling with debilitating issues and need help from like a scholarship perspective.
Have you spent
that'd be
time
awesome.
thinking about how to train sitters and guides to practice back at home? So it brings the cost down to like, $10 a session. If you're growing at home and like doing it with your friends or something, or just
I think that could be absolutely possible. I personally haven't done that. I know there is the Guild of Guides, I believe, that does some.
I've seen
does something like that. But again, just from a business perspective, that's not something that I would obviously advertise, or that's not something that I would openly talk about. If I'm doing ceremonies. So I think that's where then the Jamaica and the Amazonia thing comes in, is if we're really going to get the word out, it's going to require a substantial push from a marketing and promotional perspective, where basically we're just going to play the same game that these other companies have done, but we're going to do it with more authenticity and honesty, with a much better end result for the individual who goes through the experience.
Technical question. Do you know how many grams you ate, or the species, subspecies, or in Jamaica? Sorry, in Jamaica for your sessions? Yeah. Do you know how many grams of psilocybin mushroom you had, or this like species or subspecies or whatever? It
was cubensis, cubensis mushrooms. I had 3 grams the night that I took it. Some people went as high as 6 to 7 grams. So yeah, these are adults who are Americans who are large.
Got it.
Grown men who are 6'3" and 230. And it's also, they're also older. They're more mature. I think you give 6 grams to an 18-year-old, that's trouble. You give 6 grams to someone who's 60 and has been through a few walks of life. As long as you provide that container, it's going to be a safe space for them to explore their own consciousness, I think.
Absolutely. That's kind of what we see with breathwork a little bit too. It's, maybe the younger people don't blow up as much right away, but the older people seem less shocked that stuff comes up for them. They know they've got baggage, and that kind of stuff is safe to bring up in that container, that setting. So that's really cool. I'm really interested to talk to him. What's his name one more time?
Erik Osbourne from Myco Meditations. Yeah, we can provide a link in the show notes. I'll send him over the podcast once awesome. You guys get it going. And he's a great guy, and he's doing a good thing down there. They've got a good thing going on.
So what do you have in your future? We talked about these retreats you're thinking about running. Is there anything else? Like I know you're actually traveling the whole country and sometimes internationally to speak on microdosing as well.
Yeah, so a lot of what I've been doing so far from like a short-term perspective, again, I see microdosing as just an interesting way to get a foot in the door with a lot of like a kind of cross-cultural group of people. And so we did an event in microdosing in Amsterdam, where people could actually take microdoses because truffles are legal there. So that was a really, really cool event. And we're going to do another one in late March. If you have any European listeners who want to come, I can send out details.
Cool.
I did one in Denver, and then I'm kind of doing a brief tour through like DC, Baltimore, Philly, New York, Norway, Portugal, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, and then the Bay Area and Portland. And so I'm just basically trying to organize microdosing events where I give a talk about microdosing, talk about some of these things that we've been discussing on the show today. And then we also have a panel of people from the community who have tried microdosing themselves, who talk about their own experience for like 5 or 10 minutes. And then we field questions and discuss these things. And so that's, for me, that's like a more short-term thing, is I want to meet a lot of people. I want to get in front of them. I want to talk to them, and I want to hear their story, and I want to engage them. And I think this is a great way to do that, again, because microdosing is hitting so many people who have never had an interest in psychedelics before, or who maybe are like 60, 65. They used to take mushrooms when they were 20, haven't touched it in 40 years, but now they're kind of finding interest in it again. So like engaging with those people is interesting. So that's more short term. I'm working on a book about microdosing. And then more long term, it's just like, the third wave as from a business model from that perspective. I'm looking to facilitate experiences for people in a legal way that help them with their psychospiritual and personal growth. And we're going to create a number of containers to help facilitate those experiences for people, and those might be for people who are struggling with PTSD, depression, some of these issues. Those might be for people who are in the tech world, or people who want to use psychedelics as tools for creativity and problem solving and innovation and breakthroughs. Things of that nature is what we're going into, and that's kind of like the next stop along the way. A lot of the work I've been doing so far has been building the base, the foundation for that. The podcast and the content that we're producing, and the forum that we just got up and going, and we have a microdosing forum, things of that nature. Cool. And that's kind of laying the foundation for what's to come, because I think we're at a really interesting time in psychedelic history, and the psychedelic renaissance, the third wave of psychedelics is upon us, and I think it's incumbent upon us to take action and do with it what we can.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time. Is there anything in particular other people are doing that's really exciting or new sounding to you?
It's a good question. And if nothing that jumps to mind immediately, I can tell you, I know there's someone in California who's synthetically creating like a legal substance that people can microdose with that mimics what LSD or mushrooms would do, and they're doing small clinical trials right now amongst a small group of people. I've heard about that, but of course it's a synthetic, it's brand new, so like I don't know if I would touch the stuff necessarily, but a lot of people in Silicon Valley are willing to optimize in any way possible. Yeah. I think probably some research that we could see coming out fairly soon is MAPS is starting their phase 3 trials for MDMA and PTSD within the next maybe 6 months. Tim Ferris, about a year ago, raised $100,000 for Johns Hopkins to do research on treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin. And I don't know where that is. I'd like to talk to Roland about that, Roland Griffiths, who's heading up that research. I might try to meet him in Baltimore when I'm there. I'd be curious to know when those results are coming out. And what those results are, because I think that will be extremely effective. Because a lot of the research that we've seen so far has simply been for psilocybin and end-of-life anxiety. Right. People have terminal cancer, and so it'd be interesting to see for just regular everyday folks how effective it is. And I'm assuming it will be very effective. So from a research perspective, I think that's interesting. There's a really interesting organization called Symbio, which is a kind of startup incubator, we could say, a venture incubator. Dennis McKenna is actually the CEO. It's his project. And David Guyon is doing their operations. David's a wonderful dude. You guys should get him on the show if you can. He's really cool. And they're starting that where they're incubating plant medicine technology in a way, or they're acting as an incubator for plant medicine. So one of the projects that they're working on, which David presented on at the Global Ibogaine Conference, is they're creating they're taking like indole alkaloids from Ibogaine and working to create like a synthesized version of them in the lab. Huh. Because Ibogaine is going extinct in the wild, and it takes like 7 years to grow back. So because of the opioid epidemic and the heroin epidemic that we're seeing, and because more and more people are turning to plant medicines, it's likely there will be a strong demand for Ibogaine going forward. And so if we can synthesize that in a way that is repeatable, while still keeping the business practices ethical, and they're like a B corporation, a benefit corporation, then I think that might be a cool thing. So I think that's all that comes to mind immediately. If I think of anything else, I'll tell you later, I suppose.
I appreciate it. There's this one thing I wanted to throw at you. Daniel McQueen, Medicinal Mindfulness. Have you heard of him?
Vaguely.
Worth reaching out to. Fascinating dude.
Okay.
He put on a conference in Boulder recently. Dennis McKenna showed up, so that was fun.
Okay, that's why I'd heard of it. Yeah. Okay, yep. Like Psychedelic Shine.
It was a really fun event. Daniel had kind of a keynote of sorts where he kind of said, like, where are we at currently? What might the future look like? And what might, like, the far reaches of our imagination look like for a psychedelic future? And he said he was drawing all these similarities between space exploration and psychedelic exploration. And said, why not have, like, a NASA for psychedelics? And developed this idea around using anesthesia machines to administer long-lasting doses of DMT. So, like, see what it looks like. Hey. So he even claimed that Strassman, he got the chance to ask Strassman, so if it was possible, how long would you want to stay in for? And Strassman responded, a couple days. Right? Right? Like, amazing. And so, McKenna goes later on, if this ever becomes possible, I'm throwing down the gauntlet at Strassman.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Pretty hilarious to see that go down. But, like, that opens up all these crazy, almost philosophical frontiers. Not necessarily... Well, I thought of a way to make it happen. You've probably heard of the people doing, like, seasteading, the Seasteading Institute. Like, how do we go outside of international boundaries and, provide medical treatments that aren't legal? Like, what if you had a little flotilla out, like, just out in international waters off in New York or LA? And so you had, you flew out an anesthesiologist, a handful of chemists, and you just went ham for, like, a couple months. Then it's possible. It just takes money. You could probably get your own little cruise boat out there. And, if you're a Saudi royal, it's very possible. They're probably already doing it. Who knows?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that we don't know. It's like a repeat of MK Ultra, but with Saudi princes.
For pleasure.
Princes. Yeah, for pleasure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I always wonder about what super elite people are doing for, drug use and stuff like that. They probably have really exciting synthetic materials and novel plants that we don't even know about from the various Indonesian islands,
It could be, or deep in the Amazon, or I don't know.
Yeah, I'd love to know. Anybody out there listening, let me know. Just want to
write me first.
Yeah. So cool. I think we're a little over an hour of recording. People can find you at thirdwave.co. Any other sites you want to point them to?
The Third Wave, thirdwave.co. We launched our microdosing forum, so forum.thethirdwave.co if people are interested in that. And, my podcast is Psychedelia, the Psychedelia podcast, conversations about the third wave. So that's probably the best place to find me. Send me an email, shoot me a message. We have lots of free content and kind of downloads on our website if you guys want to check that out. So yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It was super fun. We should definitely do this again.
Absolutely.
I'll interview you. I'll interrogate you, and you can come on my podcast. How about that?
That's fantastic.
That'd be great.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and also too, do you have your events on the Third Wave so people can find you? I know you said you had something coming up in Philly and New York and Maryland, if people want to, or in that region.
Yeah, so we do have a post on there. I'll put it on the front page. I'll do that later on today. I was waiting for all the links to come through. So we have the events set up in DC, Baltimore, and Philly. We're waiting in the New York.
Cool.
And some of the other ones are just later in the future, so we haven't quite put them up. But we'll put those up, and people can RSVP that way as well. Totally.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, man. It's been great talking to you and learning about your project. And yeah, it's been awesome.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, guys.